Hello, my name is Nathan Perkypal. I'm from the Hawke's Bay Regional Coordinator, New Zealand Land Care Trust. We're going to sit and talk today about lifestyle blocks and wetlands around lifestyle blocks, partly aiming at using wetlands to manage runoff and pollutions, but also for biodiversity and aesthetic reasons. My background is in wetland restoration. I've been doing wetland restoration for about 15 years, both in the US and New Zealand, and have done thousands or hundreds of hectares of wetlands across the area. Wetlands are an important topic here in New Zealand because we've lost 90%, and in some areas even greater than 90% of our wetlands, which means that those species that are dependent on wetlands are also lost. So we lose a lot of biodiversity, and wetlands are usually very high in biodiversity because they're very productive systems. We've also got important threatened and endangered species that use wetlands, such as rails and crakes and bittern. And bittern are probably one of our most endangered species here in New Zealand. And which we can reverse their declines by putting in wetlands that are limiting the population. And we are still losing some wetlands around loopholes in the regional, the RMA and some of the regional planning and stuff. So it is an important topic for this day and age. The Resource Management Act defines a wetland as permanently or intermittently wet areas, shallow water and land water margins that support natural ecosystem, plants, animals that are adapted to wet conditions. It's a very broad definition, and that also includes riparian areas along streams as wetlands. This definition has changed a little bit around regional councils have altered the definition, have limited some areas, especially around the intermittently wet areas, and there's some issues around there. Ramsar has a fairly broad definition that is areas of marsh, fen, peatland, or water, whether natural or artificial, permanent or temporary, with water that is static or flowing, fresh, brackish, or salt, including areas of marine water, the depth at which the low tide does not exceed 6 meters. What's interesting in the Ramsar Convention is that they recognize artificial wetlands and man-made wetlands, which is really, really cool and broad. Just to go over a few terms today, just to get people on the right thing. Wetland restoration is basically returning that wetland to what it was previously before it was degraded. A lot of wetland restoration efforts do not always get to that formal condition, that original condition, but attempt to do that. Enhancement is really an interesting one because everybody says, oh, we're doing wetland restoration, but a lot of times they're doing enhancement work, which is basically like planting up plants and enhancing the wetland instead of actually restoring the wetland. I look at restoration like somebody who has a classic car. They could paint it and smooth it up and make it look on the nice side, which is enhancement. But if the engine's not running properly, it isn't restored completely. Where restoration is fixing everything within that car, where enhancement's just making it look good. So around restoration, usually a lot of restoration work involves restoring hydrology. Wetland creation is establishing a wetland on a site that historically there were no wetlands. And that happens a lot around people who want to create areas for duck shooting or just want to create a little bit of wetland on their place. And then get down to constructed wetlands. And this is where we'll have a little bit of chat at, but constructed wetlands are sort of created wetlands, but they're designed and constructed to treat wastewater using the natural processes that a natural wetland would. Constructed wetlands usually are very engineered. They have a lot of pipes and stuff going from one cell to the next and that kind of thing. They can go from very simple to very, highly engineered. When we talk about water quality on lifestyle blocks and that kind of thing, we are going to probably talk about, creating or restoring a wetland, and then, some constructed wetlands component to it to improve water quality. So what uses are wetlands? Well, the two main ones outside of just having a wetland for aesthetics region is water quality and biodiversity. Now we can have a wetland design for both water quality and biodiversity, or we can have a wetland designed mainly for water quality. When we are looking at putting a wetland in, we're looking at land that is less than a 6% slope. If you get too steep a slope, you have to build a big dam wall. When you build a dam wall, you end up with deep water, which is not really a wetland, and it doesn't function as a wetland. Also, dam walls tend to fail. So when I do wetland restoration, or we try to avoid dam walls, we got to know what soil types that we're building our wetlands on, and I will touch on the soil types later. And then the size. If we are dealing with water quality, we want to look at 1 to 5% of the catchments. So 1 to 5% of the catchment will be the size of the wetland, which will remove between 30 to 70% of the suspended solids, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and will help improve water quality. One lean towards more 5% than 1%, but we got to deal with what we have in land. And what kind of wetland type do we want to design? If we want for water quality and biodiversity, we might include some open water to enhance foraging for craigs and bittern and waterfowl. If we want it just for water quality, we just want shallow wetlands that are completely filled with vegetation. The second the next thing is water source. And we're looking at what's your water source for your wetland. Is it groundwater to feed your wetland, or using surface water? If we are looking for water quality, basically we generally are looking at surface water flow into the wetland to clean that surface water flow. So soil types, it should be more soil textures. We get 4 basic soil types: silt, sand, clay, loam. And some are good for wetlands and some other. And if you look at what's good for wetlands, usually there's a clay component to that. And that's because the clay components compact really well and hold water really well without draining. You can't build a wetland on sand really well unless you have a high water table. Same way around another soil type is peat, which I didn't include there, but peat is usually around water table. And usually under the peat, there's a good clay pan or something that holds that water in. But when we're looking for building wetlands, we are looking for a soil type there that has some type of clay in it. I generally try to avoid the sandy clays because it's not near as good, but you can create wetlands in it. So we'll talk about several different wetland types, especially those for improving water quality. The first is it's not really a wetland, but the one I want to talk about is swales. But I want to talk about wet swales. Swales that are designed to hold water temporarily and have wetland vegetation in to clean it. And these are probably what we would find suitable for a lot of lifestyle blocks. Is a swale that directs the water from a paddock away from the paddock, but also holds it in places to treat it. They're low cost. They can be constructed by the landowner really easily without a lot of expertise. Easy to maintain, so you don't have to worry about too much stuff. They have a potential for high biodiversity values. Usually there's no consent required, and they reduce downstream flooding because they slow the water across the land. The downfall is if you got high strength effluents, which we generally don't have in lifestyle blocks, it's not suited for that, and generally not suited for very steep gradients. So if you're in steep hill country, you might look at something else. If you got a lot of silt coming off your land, you might have to clean the swales out, and you can design the swale that the sediment falls out early on, and you can treat the water out so you only have to clean part of the swale. They're very effective, inexpensive to build, and it can be good for small areas. One that I really like, especially here in New Zealand, where most of our land is drained by open drainage ditches, is in-ditch wetlands. And an in-ditch wetland basically is a drainage ditch that's just wide and usually about double the width, and planted with native vegetation and usually sometimes with a couple water control structures in there to hold water back. And basically that allows for the water to flow off the top of the land, but sits in the ditch and allows for the vegetation to uptake and denitrify the water and reduce the sediment going um, into the waterways. Again, these are low cost because they're just expanding a ditch that's already there. When you're cleaning your ditch out, you just work with the digger operator to expand them. They take a little bit of design that really use experts to help you with design. And the other downfall is if the ditch is managed by regional or district councils, then you got to get a consent to do this. But they don't require a lot of land. They're easy to construct. They do have biodiversity values and are very efficient. The downside is you really have to make sure that you allow for adequate flow of water off the land. And again, they're not suitable for high strength effluents, but generally we're talking about lifestyle blocks. So we're not talking about milking pads and that kind of thing. So we don't usually have high strength effluent going into these ditches. And then restored wetlands. Ideally, if you got a wetland to restore that actually catches your land above you, is actually an ideal place to restore wetlands, that you can catch water and treat water in a natural wetland that has a lot of biodiversity values. Usually these restored wetlands are wetlands that were drained in the past and still not productive because the soils are probably still wet. A restored wetland, after you get it, the hydrology restored and planted, its maintenance is pretty cheap, just a little bit of weed control off and on. Lower cost than constructed wetland because of less engineering design, very high biodiversity values. Again, you reduce downstream flooding because you're holding water back on the landscape. And again, I wouldn't put high strength effluents in. Some restored wetlands, depending on size and territorial or regional authorities, may require consent. You just have to work with your local councils to decide that, and generally require a pretty large area of land depending upon how much water you're capturing. If we're talking about small lifestyle blocks, then we don't really have to. But again, if we're talking about water quality, we're looking at 1 to 5% of the catchment that flows into there. And then constructed wetlands. They can have high ecological values if designed right. Usually they're designed to treat high contamination, and a lot of times they're multi-celled. So you've got, if you're treating effluent coming off a piggery, you'll have up to 12 cells, and the effluent will go from one cell to the next and clean out. At the bottom at the 12th cell, the water should be clean enough to actually drink, because the wetlands are your first cells generally take out the high suspended solids. The second cell starts cleaning up the E. coli and the nutrients, and then you just keep finishing it off as it goes down. So they can be very highly complex. And again, a lot of high engineering goes into a lot of constructed wetlands, because you've got a flow rate that flows through there with high effluents. It flows about 1 meter a day, your water flow. So you got to really do your math to understand these. And I would say constructed wetlands need a lot of professional help to do. There's a high retention time of the water because you're treating high effluents. Again, large land requirements. Like I said, if you're high effluent, you're going to have multi-cells. Will probably most likely require resource consent, and that also deals with the release of effluents into a wetland system. Again, a high maintenance commitment, because the first couple cells will need to be desilted and cleaned up on a regular basis. And there's a high cost, mainly because it's a highly engineered type of thing. So when I'm dealing with most landowners, farmers, lifestyle block stuff, most of mine are hybrid between a constructed wetland and a natural wetland. If we can put a natural wetland in, or I create a wetland that's very natural but not a constructed, mainly because we're not dealing with high contamination, effluent contamination. I'll talk about a little bit, and this is where we get in the lifestyle blocks. End of field wetlands are actually ideal. They take flows off the end of the field, treat the flows before they go down lower into the catchment. Because they're end of field, they're generally smaller, and so you're treating a little bit of runoff. This one here actually is treating 2 fields, actually, and there's drainage ditches on that top terrace and this terrace that come down into this wetland. They're very efficient and easy to do, and you treat the water before it gets down into your main waterways. And I want to touch base with seepage wetlands. The seepage wetlands are ideal wetlands. They're very good at removing nutrients. And if we look at this, the seepage wetland starts here at the top and seeps down through. So if this whole seepage was fenced and allowed to grow up, it would remove all that, most of that nutrients coming off that land, and very effectively. There's times that you can take these seepage wetlands and put water control structures in them just to slow the water down, to actually end up with more water treatment. But we're talking about lifestyle blocks. So if you have these seepage wetlands, the biggest thing to do is protect them. If they're degraded a little bit of enhancement with planting and possibly some water control structures in there if you need to. But most of the times these seepage wetlands just need a little bit of fencing and a little bit of tender love and care, and they'll do the work for you. So when we're talking about wetlands for cleaning up water, the wetlands basically hold the water. What does the work is the rotting material in the bottom of the wetland, the organic soils, the vegetation growing in it. So when we're talking, and the main thing is getting that vegetation established. So we're looking at emergent vegetation and stuff that grows ideally year-round. Raupo and some of the bulbochenus die back in the wintertime, so they're not as effective of removing nitrogen and phosphorus in the winter as they are during the summer. So you want to look at those plants that grow year-round, or stay green year-round. They're deep-rooted, strong rhizomes and massive fibrous roots, which a lot of our sedges fill that really well. A considerable biomass and stem densities, surface area to increase that microbial action, and efficient oxygen transport. So, really robust plants, vegetation plants, but a lot of them you can see, down here at the bottom we have Potamogeton, which is a emergent that handles deep water. We got Caricsectus, and then over here on the right we've got bulbochenus, but bulbochenus dies back. But a lot of your other sedges and rushes do really good jobs at it. It's just when I do it, I'd put a mixture of different plants in, because diversity not only increases the biodiversity of your wetland, but it also increases the efficiency of the wetland. And if Raupo is growing in there and you have other plants there, when the Raupo or the bulbochenus dies back, the other plants can take up and do a lot of that work for it. When we're looking around for a place to put wetland, the thing that I'm always concerned about is wetland drainage. And it is very interesting where you find drainage. Most of New Zealand has some type of drainage through their system. And if there was a wetland there, there was probably most likely some type of drainage. What you look for is low areas along in the field, which are usually drainage ditches, and sometimes you can see where there's subsurface drainage with drainage pipe. And there's here to your right is an old brick and clay drainage system. These, you have to know where these are. If you put a wetland in and still have subsurface drainage, your wetland will fail. And the next thing you want to do is create a test pit, and the test pit allows me to see what the groundwater level is. Obviously, in this lower one, there's groundwater levels there fairly down, where this top one, there's actually a pretty high groundwater level. And also I look at soil types. I've got, you know, an organic layer, and then we've got a clay, silty clay soil, down to a very dominant clay soil. So I know I've got good soil here to build a wetland in. And then you want to do a layout. You know, you can get really technical and get on the computer and draw these landscaping layouts, or you can just hand draw what we do. I do a lot of sketching of like this one when I'm talking to a landowner, and we just say, all right, this is general idea what we're going to be, you know, and then how we're going to deal with it. See right here, we're putting a couple logs in straight up and down to create snags. Logs buried in the end and going down. This creates habitat for our native fish and eels, and also roosting places for bittern and ducks. What the black stuff there is, we created deep holes, and then we just put a little bit of dirt right there, create a little bit of an island there. So it made it look like a tree would have fallen down, create that deep hole, and that's where the roots sit in. A shallow pool area here, we wanted it really shallow. You know, so yeah, we just do a general layout, which allows us, when we're building the wetland, to know where we're going to go. We generally, it's an idea, but a lot of times when you get building the wetlands, you start moving things around. Basically, once you start seeing how the wetland forms, like, oh, I want something over here and that kind of thing. But it's good to have a good layout. So no matter if I'm taking surface water or groundwater, the first thing I do is create an upside down dam. We call it a groundwater dam. So what I do is at the bottom of the wetland, we dig a trench down to an impermeable layer. Here in New Zealand, a lot of that times it's a clay, sometimes a marine clay, but it's a clay that water just can't penetrate through. And then after we dig that trench, we fill that trench with compacted clay, silty clay, to create a water barrier to pick up the water levels. And this does two things. It raises the groundwater level, but it also, if you're collecting surface water, prevents the surface water from flowing underneath your wetland and out. And what we see here is soil is laid down in layers, and water moves through those layers. So we've just, by doing this, also disrupted that layers and push water up, and it allows for the water holding capacity of your wetland. When we're building wetlands, we really got to, learn how to use a laser level or a dumpy level, and so we know where our water levels are going to be. When we're building wetlands for water treatment, we're looking at water levels less than a half a meter. But if we're looking for biodiversity, we want some areas in that wetland that could be as deep as a meter. If we really want to, if we get a bigger wetland and we want to increase some more biodiversity and get bigger birds like swans in, or New Zealand scaup, then we want 1.5 to 2 meters. So it's really good to know what water levels you are, and as you're digging, have somebody measuring what your water depths are. So after we create our groundwater dam, we basically dig down. I don't build dam walls that often because dam walls will fail. I go down. It costs a little bit more, but a wetland that's dug down will last for centuries. So what we just go after and create the bowl. And then after we do all the excavation of the bowl, we just take the topsoil that we've taken off originally, and we put a thin layer of topsoil on. What this does, especially in treatment wetlands, adds that carbon that we need in wetlands to help denitrify the water, but it also gives a substrate of rich soil for your wetland plants to start growing and establish. If you just left the bowl exposed, usually it's a clay-dominated soil or a silty, loamy soil, and it's not great for growing things. So I just save, when I do excavate the bowls, I take the topsoil, save it, and then spread it across the top of the wetland, only 10 to 15 centimeters. And that provides really good growth. And what I've found sometimes in restoring wetlands that have been drained for 50 years or so, there's still a seed source in there, and we get a growth of a lot of rushes and stuff already without even doing any planting. After you spread the soils, we do a bit of landscaping. As you can see, we've added some islands here, and some woody material. Again, the woody material was added for biodiversity. Within hours of putting this wetland in, we'd had kingfishers coming in and egrets coming into this wetland. But also it adds that carbon into the system to help start that denitrification process, and also creates habitat for invertebrates and everything else. And you'll notice that around here there's some grass growing, but there's actually some rushes that are starting to come into this one. This is only taken weeks after we did the wetland. So where to from here? The best thing to do is to talk to your local professional. Contact New Zealand Lake Care Trust, and we can put you in contact with the right people. Fish and Game usually has some people that are very good. I've personally trained some of these people in Fish and Game, so I know that some of them are very competent. Regional councils generally can provide you with some information, especially around consent and possible funding. Develop a plan. Look at your property as you're looking at the future of your property. Where would the best place to be for your wetland in that low-lying area? Is that's not great? Would it be great to put a wetland there? That kind of thing. Costing out the wetlands. They're inexpensive to build. I can build wetlands up to a half hectare for $3 grand or $4 grand. It's the planting that comes in afterwards, and the planting if you put $4 grand into excavator work, you're going to put in 15 grand or so in the plants, depending upon how fast you want the plants to establish. A lot of the aquatic plants, if you plant them thinly, they'll take over. Like I said, if you're not in a hurry, you plant it thin and let them naturally take over. But there is a costly thing. And then funding. Funding's always a challenge. There's a lot of funding, usually through regional councils, through the Game Bird Habitat Trust, and a few other places that offer funding. And you need to have a little bit of talk. And your regional council of Fish and Game and New Zealand Lake Care Trust reps will be able to point you in the right direction. I'd like to say thanks for listening to me. This was just a basic introduction. It's really can get some technical in there, and I could spend hours talking about finding drainage wetlands and identifying wetlands and stuff, but I just wanted to give you guys an overview what you have so you can start planning these things. And then once you understand what you're looking for and what you're planning, then you can go and start doing this. And I encourage you to put wetlands in wherever you can, because I enjoy building wetlands and like seeing them around it, and they enhance biodiversity. And we need to bring more wetlands back. And they are very effective at cleaning most of our runoff off our properties. So I thank you for your time. Cheers.